graphic depth. So if you know what the letters sound like, you know how to say pretty much everything in Polish. English, as we know too well, does not work that way. So giving your students an opportunity to read words aloud from a text should reinforce the connections between what they see and what they would hear and what they have to say. So there are very good reasons for bringing in a bit of reading aloud in your lessons. But I still wondered, how can you do it so that it wouldn't just take up time and be boring for the students and result in the same experiences that I'd had myself at school? So I started thinking about performing a little experiment. I wanted to do something with my students, and fresh off getting through my master's, where I'd done a bit of research, but not action research for my thesis, I started thinking, oh, you know what, actually, I kind of want to know what it's like to do action research. Everyone keeps saying you should integrate it into your teaching. Maybe this is the opportunity. This is something I'm interested in. I want to see what would happen if I did it. I'm not going to be able to set up experimental controls in the way that I might like, but I could certainly do a little bit of an experiment to see if reading aloud can be made to work in the classroom. So I chose one of my groups. They were, by our codification, they are what we call seniors. So they're no longer looking at the young learner set of exams, but they're not quite on the road to something like the Cambridge First or even the preliminary yet. So their ages around 13 to 15, level roughly A2 plus, but of course it depends what content area you're considering in terms of their level. And I wanted this little bit of research to last about a month. I didn't want it to go on so long that it became an interrupting element of my lessons. And I also didn't want to get bored of it, to be honest, because that's one of the problems with doing research over a period of time, is that you yourself can lose enthusiasm for it. And if you don't have the enthusiasm for what you're doing, your students will pick up on it and they'll start to think, well, what's this for? Now, how did I select this class, you might wonder? This is why. This is my class. I've blurred the names as much as possible, but hands up or smiley face if you've had a situation like this where you're teaching online and pretty much every single one of your students decides that they're not going to have the camera on and they're not going to have the microphone on. Has that happened to any of you? Hands up if it has. If not, you're very fortunate people, but yeah, I see some people hands up and nodding. Yeah. And these lessons were twice a week for 90 minutes at a go. So you come into the class. Hi, how are you? Microphone goes on. I'm okay. Microphone goes off. And in some cases, that was it for the lesson. If they didn't need to speak, they wouldn't. If we were doing a task in the lesson that didn't require speaking, such as a gap fill, they would send their answers in the chat. They wouldn't tell me. Even when I sent them to breakout rooms and said, feel free just to talk in Polish if I'm not there, do that. They still didn't. They went to the breakout rooms, cameras off, muted. So I needed to do something with them. So if I was going to do some action research with anyone, I thought that this would be a good group to do it with. So the procedure that I used then was, first of all, to show my students how to use Vocaroo. Has anyone used Vocaroo here? It's been around for a long time. So what I'll do then first is I'm just going to show you. So Lisa's used Vocaroo. Yeah. Let me just share the screen so we can have a look at Vocaroo. It's been around for a long time. I thought it was new because I only discovered it quite recently, like a year ago. But when I told people about it, they were like, yeah, I've been using that since. So I demonstrated this to my students so that they knew how we would be managing the recordings in this little bit of research. And then I recorded a model of the text that we were using. So we were using English in Mind 2 for the course. There's a lot of text in there. So I would choose roughly 100 words from the nearest reading. I'd record it before the lesson in a slow but normal voice. And then I'd have the link ready so that in the lesson, I could say, okay, we're going to practice reading aloud. Please follow the link that I'm sending and listen to this a few times. Then I sent the students to breakout rooms so that they could listen at their own pace whilst they had the paper in front of them and they could follow along and read it. And I instructed them to practice with their peers. So in other words, one student ideally would start reading the text to the peers in that breakout room, maybe one or two other students that I felt they were comfortable working with. And then they would then have the opportunity to record their own version of that text. So they had a model, they had a period where they could practice and receive peer support, and then they had their recordings. The final recordings were then made by each student. And when we came back to the main room, I asked them each to send me the link in the chat. And they did, to their credit. They all did a pretty good job of doing that. These links I then saved on my Google Drive. I set up a little spreadsheet on Google Drive so that as the weeks rolled by, we did this once a week over the period of the month, pretty much. I had all of the links, and after the lesson, I would go through listening to each of the links and assessing their listening. Sorry, assessing their reading. I was assessing my own listening. So what did I want from them? Well, I wanted to see if over time, through practice and peer support and through following models, I wanted to see if their reading aloud performance would change, if there would be any improvement. I did not expect perfection, because you can't expect perfection from A2 level students. It's not fair. I mean, I don't even expect perfection from my C2 level students. I want something along the lines of what Jenkins outlined in the Lingua Franca core, because a lot of my own students, they're not the sort of students who are thinking yet about going to England or America to study at university. They're not looking to emigrate. They're the sort of people who in the future might run a business in Poland that does that will have agreements with China or Turkey. So English is a lingua franca. They don't need to be perfect in their speaking performance. They need to be intelligible. So I made a list of what I would count as mistakes. So if the student, for example, missed a word, if it said duck and they just said duck, I would count that as a reading performance mistake. If they said the wrong word, and this happened quite a lot, if they said, for example, population instead of popular, that would be considered a mistake. And then getting more into the nitty gritty, if the phoneme production was inappropriate. So I took the example here as pronouncing scheme as skim instead of scheme, or something along those lines. If the students did that, or sheem instead of scheme, that would count as a mistake. And strong L1 intrusion, I counted as a mistake. So if a student pronounced the R in English very strongly, I would count that as a mistake, because even in English as a lingua franca, we want that softer R, especially the terminal R. So when I had a student pronouncing your as yor, the R counted as a mistake. Some things I would not count as mistakes. You might see this as a little bit arbitrary, but I was consistent throughout. And I think that's really the key. As long as you're consistent and you establish what you're looking at and what you're not looking at from the beginning, you can still see relative changes. So I didn't think that, for example, with names, if there was mild deviation from received pronunciation, this kind of base standard, that would be okay. So if the students didn't really know that you'd say Toronto instead of Toronto, I didn't really mind too much there, because it wouldn't get in the way of understanding too much. And if the stress pattern was slightly off, so for example, pronouncing bicycle with the second syllable stressed rather than the first. So bicycle, that was not a big problem for me. And I'm definitely not worried. I've stopped worrying, in fact, about the difference between F and V on the one hand and the tooth sounds on the other. I just don't think that it's necessary for us to spend any time in our lessons worrying about it. Because if you ask somebody how many carrots they've got and they say they've got 3, we're not going to suddenly say, oh, you better catch them then before they escape. A misunderstanding like that is simply not going to happen. And I couldn't think of any cases where the substitution would impede communication. If you can think of such an example, please write it in the chat. I'd love to see it. And if I'm wrong, of course, I'd hold my hands up and say I was wrong. So now we know what were mistakes in my book and what were not. The texts that I chose were all from the course book so that they were of the right level and they didn't progress too fast. I didn't want the students to find that they're reading a text that they're not prepared to read. So of course, there was some progression because we're going further into the course, but not much because we've only got a 1-month window here for the whole experiment. And I tried to choose roughly 100 words because that way I'd have enough sample to be able to count the mistakes, but also not so much that I would start getting fatigue mistakes. I didn't want the students just to get tired or bored if they had to read 300 or 500 words. That would be just far too much. They would get tired of doing it. I'd get tired of assessing it. So I put the students into groups according to what I thought would be their working preferences for the peer support and for general level of ability. Group 1 then was composed of 2 students. They missed a couple of lessons, unfortunately, so the chart here is incomplete. This was one of the weaknesses of the research. Basically, the size of the group that I had was not ideal for this sort of experiment. And of course, I'd love to repeat it in the future with some just little tweaks. But as you can see, S1 made slight improvements over the course of the experiment. So they started the first test, which was done pretty much, the tests I should have mentioned were not supplied with models. I wanted to see if they were able to produce these sounds without me guiding them. Each of the P's were the practices. So they had 6 practices with 6 different model texts. So the first test, student 1 got about 13% mistakes. So basically 13 out of 100 words were mispronounced. And by the end, they'd got it down to about 10%. So a marginal improvement. And the same was more or less true for student 2. So for this group, not a very great change. Group 2, however, showed a much better performance. Student 3 managed to go from making a mistake in 1/5 of all the words that she said down to 10%. So a big improvement there, I would say. And the other student in that group went from nearly 15% of all of the words containing mistakes down to about 5%. So some pretty good results there, looking at the tests. But it's interesting that the progress was not linear. There were bumps on the road. And I think that's natural because, student performance varies from day to day anyway. As you move from one lesson to the next, you find that students who you thought understood a particular grammar point come back the next lesson and they seem to have lost that cognitive connection. The same thing happens with people's pronunciation, especially when the text is relatively unfamiliar. But I was very pleased with this group's performance. And I was particularly pleased with their attitude. One of the students actually asked me, why are we doing this? And I said, I was amazed. They've asked me a question. And it was about the first time in the semester they had asked me a question of their own volition. I couldn't believe it. I felt so wonderful for those 5 minutes. And I explained that, you know, because the groups are so quiet these days, we need to do some reading practice. We need to produce something. And if they're not going to tell me about their weekend, they can at least read something and I can hear them. But also, I told him I was doing a little experiment to see if with practice they'd get better. And he was like, oh, okay. So he actually started really trying hard. He was very happy on practice number 4, where he managed to get through the whole reading with only, I think, 1 mistake. He worked very hard. And I popped into the breakout room on that session as well as with all the others, but I happened to be there whilst he was practicing with his partner, and he kept asking the partner, please tell me if I make a mistake. Does that sound okay? He was repeating particular sentences and particular words, trying to get everything right. I'm not sure what exactly happened for him in practice 6, but come the final test, he did well compared to the start. Another very interesting one is the final group, which is group 3. Now, group 3, we've only got 1 student, but that's not to say that the student worked alone. There are 2 students who I excluded from the experiment. One, because I didn't have that student when we started. I had a student who joined the class halfway through this little experiment, so it wasn't really fair to include that student in the project. And another who was absent more often than not. But this student always had a peer. Always had somebody to work with. But as you can see, this is a student who over the course of the project didn't really make any progress comparing the start with the finish, and even got quite a bit worse at one stage. But for one of the readings, P4, did a fantastic job. So I played that track back to the student to ask what they thought was different about that one. Why did they do so much better? And it was because they'd finally started paying attention, if only for that one lesson, on their the Polish incursions into their production. So they managed to drop that terminal R sound to go for a more English sound. And we did all sorts of things to raise awareness of that particular problem. One of my favorite being basically lifted from the King's Speech, but the idea of talking with marbles in your mouth, or at least a pen. So if you speak too much like a Polish speaker, then when you put a pen in your mouth, you sound like you grew up in London, innit? That worked quite well. I don't think she recorded herself with a pen in her mouth, although it would certainly explain the improvement, but it raised awareness for that student and for others in terms of what they could do to improve their pronunciation. So what did I learn from this whole thing? Well, according to the results of this little bit of research, the worst thing that can happen with reading aloud in this way of doing it is that the students don't get any worse. So there can't be any harm done. And for some of these students, it literally was the only time that they spoke in those lessons. They didn't speak at any other stage, either because they didn't really want to, or because they were just tired because they had their lessons with me at 3:30 in the afternoon. They'd already had 7 hours of regular school. They'd finished mentally. They were out of it by the time they came to me. So I can understand them, and I never really kind of shouted at them to say, oi, turn on your cameras, please. Where are you guys? You've got to show a bit of understanding, I suppose. It also taught me that drawing explicit attention, really saying to them, this is what English sounds like compared to what you're producing. Let's listen to the difference. Drawing attention that way can have benefits. And if I was to do the same experiment with that group now, I imagine that the results would probably follow the same course, but shifting down a little bit on the scales, because they all seem to be doing a bit better with their pronunciation. Because we keep referring back to this experiment. We keep saying, well, remember what we did last semester when we did the recordings? Do you remember what we said about how English sounds? So we have a touchstone and we can keep returning to it. And also, using things like Vocaroo can really solve some of the biggest problems that I could see with reading aloud. If we go back to that opening anecdote of me being one of 20 in a class, how many people were ever involved in reading aloud? The teacher was kind of half paying attention. One person was speaking, the others simply listened. And to do 2 minutes of reading in a class of 20 that way would take 40 minutes, and that is unacceptable. But using something like Vocaroo and breakout rooms, you basically put everything in parallel and it scales very well. So if you had 20 students, then you could probably have 10 breakout rooms. They do a bit of practice and then they record. So that means that those 2 minutes of speaking, reading aloud, only really becomes maybe 6 to 8 minutes in total across the board instead of 40 or 50 minutes with a lot of idle time. So using this sort of technology, the technology that wouldn't even work for us in the classroom, remember, we couldn't do this in the classroom because, well, how would you shut out the other voices? You couldn't do it in the classroom, only works online. So doing it this way really worked a treat. So in terms of the next steps, I mean, this research was really just about getting the phonemes right, because at A2 level, you get a lot of interference from L1, and you need to treat that before you can really switch your attention to other prosodic features, so sentence stress, things like that. And listening to the recordings the students made, they were focusing so much on phonetic reproduction that everything was flat. In this text, I'm reading about San Francisco, which is a city in California, that kind of thing. So in the future, yeah, we could do something where we examine how students are able to use stress patterns appropriately. The weakest part of all of this, though, was with the peer support. I had hoped that they would help each other. In some cases, they did. They would listen and then stop their partner if they heard a word was pronounced incorrectly. They knew which words would be pronounced incorrectly because they had the model available. They could say, I'm not sure, let's listen to the model again. They could say all of this in Polish if need be. But a lot of the time, they didn't do that. They didn't really work together very much, which I thought was a bit of a shame, really, because it also shows that when I send my students to breakout rooms to do collaborative tasks, I have to manage them very carefully because I can't really entrust the task to my students, not universally. Some of them, yes, they really took it and ran with it, but with others, no, you could see that there was that reticence, or simply they didn't know how to do it. So that's now leading on to the next thing for me, which is thinking about how to train my students so that they can offer more peer support. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to show you, so I think we're recording this session anyway, I'll just bring this up. I did a lot of background reading for all of this, so if anyone wants to check my references, they're all here. When the video is available, if it is, you'll be able to freeze the frame and take a look at that. I think I now have a bit of time for questions.